Yet another major assignment, the research abstracts. I have faith. You can do it. The research abstract assignment is probably closer to a standard academic type assignment than anything else you're going to do in here. You're going to find some good stuff and figure out a way to communicate that information. If everything goes according to plan, you'll probably end up with a job at some point in time. And if your college education ends up taking, you'll probably end up being a little bit of an expert in your field. The problem is, you're going to be working for bosses who probably won't be an expert in your field. It's not really their fault. They can't really know absolutely everything in the company. You would be doing a bad job of being a boss if you didn't go out of your way to hire people who knew more than you, at least in particular areas. So that's the situation you'll probably find yourself in. Knowing something really, really complex and having to explain this really, really complex thing to someone who doesn't quite know it. And that is what the research abstract assignment is about. Abstract? Get it? Ha ha ha. The research abstract. 4 abstracts, 200 plus words apiece. Formal research abstract format. I'll talk about that later. Check your own individual classes' assignment sheets for the due dates. This will be worth 100 points. Your assignment is to familiarize yourself with the major debates, concepts, and terminology of your field. Incidentally, you should have been doing this all along. This is why you were doing the problems in the field memo. It's why I put you in groups according to a specific field anyway. Furthermore, you must demonstrate your ability to clearly distill and summarize this complex information. You are to write a total of 4 abstracts of at least 200 words apiece on either a technical article, at least 2,500 words from a professional journal, an example of theoretical criticism, a chapter of a scholarly book, or similar sources of your choosing, as long as they're at that level of seriousness. You're not going to try to summarize something on Wikipedia to someone. You want to make sure it's good professional level stuff. Each abstract must begin by listing the source in question according to MLA works cited format. There is a link in links of all places that will explain it, and I even have a link to Noodle Tools, which will just ask you the proper information, have you fill in some boxes, and it will generate a citation for you. Next, provide a 2-paragraph minimum summary of the source's argument and approach. Include at least 1 paragraph contextualizing the article in relation to any ongoing debates and critically analyzing the source in question. You're not just summarizing, you want to situate this person's argument within the general field, and you want to critique it. Is this good or not? Is this the kind of thing we need to pay more attention to? What use could it be used for? Your target audience will be educated professionals not versed in your specific field. It'll be formatted as either a Word or a PDF file attachment. In addition to the normal peer review paper submission procedures, we're also going to have deadlines for the initial drafts. I don't want you to end up trying to do this all at the last minute, so I'm going to force you to get a draft in a little bit early. Now, the main job is to understand these documents from your field and somehow figure out how to condense them into a way that a non-expert will be able to read and understand and get a basic idea of what's your source is talking about. So before we get into how you're actually going to do that, let's talk about critical reading strategies a bit. You probably had someone in Comp 1 talk to you about this, but it never hurts to go over it again. We don't normally read critically. If you say pick up the campus newspaper or a magazine while you're waiting for them to put tires on your car or something like that, you're going to be doing a non-critical reading. You're going to be reading passive. You're going to be looking at facts. You're going to be trusting in a little bit. It's not going to ask you to be active in processing the information. It will be more about reacting to the stuff they give you. Critical reading is a completely different thing. It's an active process. You don't just sit there and let the information soak into your brain like liquid into a sponge. No, instead, you're constantly interrogating things. You're asking questions. You're trying to understand stuff. You ask the what, how, why questions. You come in with a certain amount of skepticism because it's their job to prove their point. You come in with a definitive purpose. You're reading this stuff for a particular reason. In the case of the research abstracts, you're reading it so you can communicate necessary information to your boss. So, how do you read critically? Well, the first strategy you need to employ is previewing. Previewing is where you try to get an overall view of the paper, the book, the article, whatever, before you start to sit down and read it properly. Read the titles, read the headings, read the first line of each paragraph, look at the research. And doing this will give you an awful lot of information as to what the paper is going to hit you with. What's your purpose in reading this? What specifically are you trying to get out of it? What was the writer's purpose in writing it? What were they trying to do? And with each of these, it'd be like, does it succeed in fulfilling your purpose? Does it succeed in fulfilling the writer's purpose? Sometimes the writer's purpose might not be as open and honest as you would expect. An example of this is that Facebook hires psychiatrists, sociologists, and a lot of academics to study how their service works. And I remember reading one where the scientist working for Facebook put out a study that says, yes, indeed, Facebook does tend to add to people finding themselves in knowledge echo chambers. If you have a point of view, Facebook is going to give you stuff that supports your own point of view more than they're going to give you stuff that challenges it. It was an interesting conclusion from someone working for Facebook, but less surprising, the scientist's response was to suggest that you read more Facebook. Because by reading more, you can force yourself to find more opinions. Is it kind of surprising that a scientist who's working for Facebook is going to stress that you probably should look at Facebook more often? That's a less noble and probably hidden purpose. To what genre does the work belong? What are the conventions of that genre? An academic paper is written a whole lot differently than something in a trade magazine. And when you know this, you get a better view of what to expect from the piece. Academic writing, for instance, you know by now that it's very front loaded. The argument's shoved right at the top. It's going to be fairly formulaic in your structure. Something in a magazine that caters to people actually in the field might not do that. Something that goes to a general educated audience definitely won't do that. It's an academic convention. And you'd probably read it differently as a result. Where can you get advice if it turns hard? And this is a question you should have a decent idea of before you start. If you end up seeing stuff that you don't understand, is there someone you can talk to? Do you know someone who knows this better than you? Do you know sources you can go to get a basic grounding in the field if you find out that you don't have enough information to really process it? And finally, by previewing, you can really get a good grasp on what reading strategies would work best. Now, while reading, there's a few different approaches you can make. I am of the mind that I don't ever really like to read anything serious without a pencil in my hand. Now, if you don't want to write in your books or you're reading the stuff electronically, you can always write in a notebook. Or in grad school, I kind of kept the Post-it industry alive because I'd use Post-its on all these books that I had to return to the library. And it still allowed me to mark up everything. But when you mark something as you're reading, it helps make the information solidify in your mind. We can only keep 5 to 9 things in short-term memory at any time. Writing stuff down is one of the tricks that helps move stuff into longer-term memory. So, what you do while you're reading. Underline key points, key phrases. If it looks like it's something of their argument, underline it. If they're defining a term, underline it. Anything that looks like it's tremendously important. Within a reason, though. You don't want to be underlining entire pages. I had someone in a theory class when I was a grad student who I looked over at their book and it had 3 pages all highlighted. Really not as all that useful when you go back to it and you don't know what you found particularly important in there. So selective, but key points, key phrases. Annotate right in the margins. And this is a place for a wider variety of types of comments. If the writer's doing something particularly complex, summarize their main points. So when you thumb through the article in the future, you can look at your notes to get a basic overview of what they were talking about. Write where you agree with or disagree with the author. And it's a good idea to do this because you should always be interrogating the authors. I could point you to any number of books in my office where I could show you a history of me arguing with the author. The first big theory book I ever got, I've done about 4 or 5 read throughs, and each time I'm arguing with a guy. This is particularly useful in the case of a research abstract because one of the things you're supposed to do is come to some kind of judgment. Helps when you mark out what exactly you think they're doing right and wrong. Refer to what the writer is doing. If they're giving you a claim, mark it. If they're giving you statistics, mark it. If they're giving counter arguments, refuting opposition, mark it. If something in the article or the chapter, whatever, raises a question or makes you concerned about something, write it down. If it connects to something else that you have seen, read and write it down. A brief example of what this looks like. This is actually from the abstract to corporate ideology in the world of Warcraft. We'll do a later video that goes into that in more depth. But I decided that I was going to give you a bit of how my comments would actually look. This is doing it in Word. I mark out the main lessons. The third comment down, I mentioned that it's a big claim. The comment after that, I make an observation where I'm trying to condense what they're saying and trying to move it into larger realm of insights. Then when they start spelling out, whenever I see a list, I tend to circle it or spell out the stuff. Business Model 1, arcade games, so on and so forth. After you finish reading it, don't put the book away and then move on immediately to something else. Sit down, write a paragraph or so summarizing what you just read. And this is another one of these tools that's going to move stuff from your short-term memory into your longer-term memory. Exploratory writing. If we're on campus together, I do this an awful lot where I have you sit down and just write about the thing you just read or the thing we just discussed because it starts getting thoughts flowing. Outline what the writer does, how they go from point to point. And again, we'll talk about this more in the World of Warcraft video. But if you can get the basic argument mapped out to point by point, you'll be able to better understand it. Now, once you get all of this stuff, it's time to start working on your abstract. You need to have the listing of your sources in MLA Works cited at the top. And from then on, there's, I believe, 6 things that you have to make sure you hit in your abstract. 1, purpose. What's the author's reason for writing it? What's the author's main idea? Spell this stuff out. If the writer comes from a specific position, like the scientist I was telling you about earlier, who is from Facebook, and they kind of had the hidden agenda of saying, don't worry about these things, just read more Facebook. It's a good kind of thing to know. And if you're trying to communicate what the source does to somebody, getting into these big questions, what was the author's reason for writing and what their main idea was, is going to be information that they need to have. You're going to want to spell out the scope. What's the author's focus in this piece? Are they trying to do everything in the world? Do they have a narrow, specific center of attention? Where does the author concentrate his or her attention in the piece? How do they do the work? What kind of evidence do they provide? How do they specifically try to convince you that their idea is valid? Some people will love to shove anecdotes to you. Some people will love to overwhelm you with statistics. Some people will set up a Socratic kind of dialogue. There's a lot of different ways to convince somebody in an argument, but you all have taken college classes before. You know about argument. How does this particular author do it? Get into their results. What are the consequences of the problem or the issue that they're talking about? What are their findings? If you extrapolate it from their findings, what kind of stuff would happen? My personal feeling on the scientist working for Facebook is that if you read more Facebook, that would probably just push you deeper into an echo chamber than pull you out. Then the recommendations. What solutions does the author present to the reader to resolve the problems of issue in the play? What does the author recommend? Conclusions. Does the author describe a cause and effect relationship or explain the origins of this issue problem? What conclusions does the author draw from his or her study of the problem? Then you bring in your own evaluation. It worked in this way, it didn't work in this way. And you can even scatter that along. When you're talking about what the author's main idea is, if you have problems with the author's claimed main idea right at the beginning, you really should tell the reader that. Because if I'm reading your research abstract, I don't just want a summary, I want to know if this is something I should spend any time on. Hopefully you've been looking for ways to make all of your work kind of coalesce into one big thing. The information that you get in here, hopefully it's based off at least a little bit on your problems in the field research, and you can always use this information in your big final report. Build towards that ultimate project. See you next video.